Hello, this is the third of the 2021 UBC Paragon webinar series. My name is Bruno Zumbo. I am professor and distinguished university scholar at the University of British Columbia. This webinar is focused on the concepts of validity, and we're looking at bridging concepts and practices. An important point to keep in mind with this one is that it's collaborative work. I provide a citation there. And many parts of this presentation reflect a sort of decade-long exchange of ideas and collaboration with Dr. Ben Shear. And it's really based on our mutual interests in psychometrics and applied statistics, including validity theory and differential item functioning. A lot of what Ben and I have talked about in terms of validity is we continue to address certain questions, such as what do test scores measure and how do we know? Dr. Shear is an assistant professor in the Research and Evaluation Methodology program in the School of Education at the University of Colorado, Boulder. This lecture today, this webinar, has grown out of and is shaped by feedback at about 20 different invited addresses, not the same presentation, but in this theme, over the last about 16 years. You'll see a list of, in the acknowledgements at the end of the presentation. At every venue, I've engaged with the audience and with other speakers on panels. And all of that has really shaped my thinking to where I'm at today. Well, today we have three broad areas that we're going to focus on. I make some introductory remarks. Then I'm going to look at the concept of validity, spend some time talking to you about the concept of validity. The third section is bridging concepts and practices. And here we are transitioning from the concept of validity to research and validation with the aid of an argument-based approach. We sort of bring in, and you'll see a little foreshadowing for you toward the end of this third section. I begin to bring together my own work and the own views that I've been developing of validity theory and the elaborated approach I'm looking at it, and merging it with an argument-based approach as well. Then there's a few concluding remarks at the end. There's some material at the end of these web pages, at the end of these PowerPoint slides that describes briefly how this webinar fits into the broader program of research, some acknowledgements, and bibliography. The connecting with the broader program of research is important because one thing you will see that one of the themes in today's webinar is that one can, and I do, often frame a lot of the psychometric research I do around validity and validation. In so doing, what I find is that I'm able to really see validity and validation as the core driving factor behind everything that I do. That does become important. It becomes very important, in fact. And so you'll see that there's a meta theory that's emerging throughout it. Every so often you'll see me pop in and out here in the top right-hand corner of your screen. So don't be distracted if I disappear for a little bit. I will reappear at certain transition points in the slides. All right. Let me begin with some introductory remarks. The concept, method, and process of validation are central to social, psychological, and health science research. Without validation, any inferences made from a measure are meaningless. In fact, I may even say without validity, but you can see here this interesting distinction. Another point that I want to highlight is throughout this presentation and this webinar, the terms measure, instrument, test, assessment, survey, and scale will be used interchangeably and in their broadest senses to mean any coding or summarization of observed phenomena. This becomes important because I don't want us to fall into traditional camps and these comfortable little sort of silos. And what I'm trying to counter is that validity applies equally to tests or measures used in language assessment, educational measurement, certification licensure, testing, social indicators, psychological measures, health status, PROMs, and PREMs. These are but a few examples. This is important. Far too often, this has again been a thread in my program of research, going back probably about 20-something years now, is that we recognize that there are unique features to educational measurement, for example, versus psychological instruments versus surveys and survey design. But in fact, when we're looking at this, there's far more in common, and we can leverage that which is in common to grow and build that, articulate that more fully. And then, of course, exploring the unique elements that you'll find in language assessment and psychological assessment, testing, health measurement, measure health status, certification, and licensure. But I argue that the core part is far more than what you'll find that is unique. So it's important here, I think, to make a few points just to sort of set the stage here. Integrating and summarizing such a vast domain as validity often, it invites often rather facile criticism. Nonetheless, if someone does not attempt to identify similarities among apparently different psychometric, methodological, and philosophic views, and to synthesize the results of various theoretical and statistical frameworks, we would probably find ourselves overwhelmed by massive independent models and investigations with little hope of communicating with anyone who does not happen to be specializing in our problem, techniques, or framework. What I'm finding over the last 34 years now that I've been actively engaged in the scholarship in this domain, both in applied and theoretical work, mathematical and more conceptual work, and philosophic work. What I find is that there is some comfort that people really do try and create these silos that allows one to protect themselves from any criticism. And, there's almost this sort of effect in which you're the only creature in this set. You're the only element in this set, and now you're, in a sense, the authority in the set. That's dangerous, in my opinion. Yes, it can give you comfort. Yes, it can also give one tremendous career advancement, but that's not the issue here. There is a great deal of interest in and a great deal of commonality across these domains. So if one goes back to these various domains of language assessment, let's look at what's in common. And then the unique parts do play a role, but they're very small, in my opinion, and very small. And they are, in a sense, the seasoning in the main dish that comes about to be validity theory. So, hence, in the interest of avoiding the monotony of the latter state of affairs, even thoroughly committed measurement specialists must welcome occasional attempts to compare, contrast, and wrestle the kernels of truth from disparate validity positions. However, while we're welcoming such attempts, we must also guard against oversimplifications and confusions. And it is it's in the interest of this latter responsibility that I write to the more general aim. I talked a little bit about this actually in 2007 and in one of my chapters on validity theory. All right. So now let us move to a few more remarks that I think are important here. Although a lot of ground will be covered in this webinar, several themes should be evident from the material I present. Let me just give you a few of these themes. There are no widely accepted series of steps that one can follow to establish validity and the inference one makes from measures in the varied and disparate fields where measurement is used. Even within fields, even within language assessment, even within psychological assessment, even within educational assessment, there is no one recipe or series of steps. One must engage in this in a meta-theoretical and a methodological point of view, and I'm going to highlight that. One needs to be reflective. Look at one's aspirations. What is one committing to do in terms of validity? What kind of inferences are being made, and begin to shape their validation research with an understanding of the various options available. The process of validation, as I see it, involves a weighing and integrating various bits of information from the whole of psychometric activities, from specifying a theory of the phenomena of interest to test design, scoring, and test evaluation, and back to the theory itself. You'll see me depict this later, some work with a colleague of mine. So it involves this weighing and integrating the various bits of information. I fall clearly in the camp of validity theorists who see the process of validation as an integrative, disciplined activity. Again, I talked about some of this in 2007 and some of the other places and other papers and chapters I published. Historically, we have moved from you'll see this in a bit, from a correlation with a criterion, something we're trying to predict. We've moved from correlation or a factor analysis to establish, quote unquote, what might be called factorial validity as sufficient evidence for validity, to an integrative approach to the process of validation involving the complex weighting of various bodies, sources, and bits of evidence. Hence, by nature, bringing the validation process squarely into the domain of disciplined inquiry and science. And I do believe there needs to be there needs to be a space created in which others can challenge our validity claims in this public discourse, in this scientific discourse that I'm going to call validation. Throughout my program of research, I've highlighted the importance of data modeling and assumptions as empirical commitments. This becomes relevant in validity theory and validation. I can see this in some of my earliest work in rank-based non-parametric statistics and in robust estimation and robust statistics. But it becomes relevant here. As André Rupp and I mentioned in 2004, we remind the reader that is the responsibility of mathematically trained psychometricians to inform those who are less versed in the statistical and psychometric theory about the consequences of their statistical and mathematical decisions to ensure that examinees are assessed fairly. I think that overview chapter in 2004 is relevant still today. It really is, and it's really emphasizing the notion of empirical commitments. The models, psychometric models, are in fact empirical commitments. As Rupp and I state, everyone knows that a useful and essential tool such as an automobile, a chainsaw, or a statistical model can be a very dangerous tool if put into the hands of people who don't have sufficient training, handling experience, or lack the willingness to be responsible users. This becomes important. What this highlights from the very beginning of a theme message in this program that you're going to hear me talk about today in this program of research is that when it comes to the handling of data, this is through modeling and statistics, one is making empirical commitments. And now modeling how one assesses these empirical commitments, how one verifies and justifies these empirical commitments become part of the validity argument. You can see now that validity is a very large umbrella for me. I find it as a very powerful tool, validity and validation, to organize and arrange my thinking and look for threads throughout the work that I've developed. Now, in 30-something years of being an active researcher and scholar, I've committed myself to getting deep understanding and to get, it's not really necessarily research. I really want to get deep understanding and then share that with others. With others. In so doing, what I do is, because of my training in mathematics, in pure mathematics, in statistics and probability, you'll see me reach out and can interconnect ideas. So my program of research covers several different, what may to some be disparate ideas, but they're far from disparate in my mind, because the overwhelming theme and brings it all together is this notion of supporting validity and validation, including the conceptual work you're going to see me talk about today. And again, Andre and I, in 2004, there's a few other chapters of mine where you can see me weave this in. Speaking of which, Don Zimmerman and I, in 2001, we formally defined test data that we say that formally test data are the realization of a stochastic event defined on a product space. And this product space is described with having two orthogonal components, omega sub I and omega sub j. And these are the probability spaces for examinees, for items and examinees respectively. So items, omega sub I, examinees, test takers, test respondents, survey respondents. And items can be tasks. So omega sub I is tasks and items. And omega sub j, that space is represents examinees, test takers, survey respondents, etc. So we define test data. They are a realization of a stochastic event defined on a product space. And there are two orthogonal components. The joint product space can be explained, or excuse me, can be expanded to include other spaces induced by raters or occasions, number of times, test retest, pre-post intervention. So this product space can actually be expanded as it is. In fact, this is a nice sort of formalization, sort of approach for generalizability theory, and where Cronbach was in his description of generalizability theory, which you'll see come up a little bit later once we start talking about Kane and views to validity. This begins to play a role. I mean, the brilliance of Cronbach's idea in his generalizability theory is that he characterizes this product space, and Cronbach, from my perspective, talks about the measurement experiment. So in some senses, a realization of this product space, you get these various what Cronbach would call facets, right? These orthogonal, here they are orthogonal components. On the experiment, they might not be. Well, that's a separate matter. You might have unbalanced designs and other such things, which make it a little harder to decompose in an orthogonal manner the variance components. But it, nonetheless, in an abstract, in a purely mathematic sense, you have a realization of a stochastic event. The orthogonal components that describe or define that stochastic event can be expanded greatly. And then one can design an experiment to try and quantify, if you wish, the uncertainty, the variability, or mean square in an ANOVA sense, from each of these components or each of these facets. So it's the fundamental element behind it. Hence, modeling of test data minimally requires sampling assumptions about items and examinees, as well as the specification of a stochastic process that is supposed to have generated the data. This is fairly abstract, but it's important to keep in mind because we now have items, tasks, right? And you have individuals, and really the modeling of measurement data minimally requires some sort of sampling assumptions about this. We can deal with that in some other presentation another time, but this is the guts, the bones of everything that we're going to talk about in terms of validity theory, and it'll come through and pay off in a few minutes. That paper was by Zimmer and I in 2001, in which we talk about the geometry of probability statistics and test theory. And it's a line of research that I've been involved with, and I've been carrying on since 1990, 1989, until very recently, even in the Journal of Mathematical Psychology, trying to develop a formal characterization of test data. And what I began to coin into term a measure theoretic view of psychometrics and measurement. All right. In summary, then, the item or task responses created by the interaction of examinees with items or tasks on a measure are considered to be indicators or markers of unobservable or latent variables. I use the term latent variable to refer to a random variable that is deliberately constructed or derived from the responses to a set of items or tasks, and that constitutes the building block of a statistical model. For example, it may be theta in IRT or factor scores in factor analysis, but it's an unobserved variable that becomes important. So now we have an observed variable, we have unobserved variables, and we're going to talk constructs, and the three are not the same in general. And those who treat those as the same really are dealing with a particular boutique case of measurement. So we have observed variables, manifestations that come from this interaction of items or tasks with respondents or examinees. We have a constructed, deliberately constructed or derived from the sets of items or tasks. The statistical problem then of measuring a latent variable can be characterized as involving two key tasks: to find a set of indicators, items, scales, tasks, performances, or more generally referred to as a measurement opportunity. That is a nod to my friend Rick Licht, who has been using that term for a while, and I've been minding for a while to use it. It's a lovely idea. It's a measurement opportunity: items, scales, tasks, performances. So you find a set of indicators, these items, scales, tasks, performances, some sort of measurement opportunity that we believe that the latent variable will imply. And B, to find a methodology for constructing a summary measure or scalar measure of the latent variable from these indicators. So if we denote the set of indicators by X, so it's X, so you have in this case Q indicators. The second part of the problem is to find a function, phi of X, so that the numerical value of phi can be regarded as an appropriate scalar measure of the unobserved or latent variable. And so I'm trying to give you a little bit of formalism to try and describe for us what is the measurement experiment? What does measurement using instruments, measures, tests, how can we define them broadly? So you have a set of indicators that are really the tasks or the responses to questions, they're the questions. The second part is then to create a function. So the numerical value, this phi of X, where X is these indicators, so the numerical value of phi can be regarded as an appropriate scalar measure of the unobserved or latent variable. In this slide, it's important to keep in mind that the main goal of modeling test data should always be to make valid inferences about the examinees. But inducing latent variables into the data structure cannot mechanically increase the validity of these measures, no matter how sophisticated the psychometric model. And we've gotten as a discipline incredibly sophisticated. The statement of phi, how sophisticated that is, and estimation routines have become, a test with poor validity will always remain so. This becomes important because what we're saying is we have test data, in a sense, if you wish. And we have an experiment characterized here. I characterize it using probability and some geometry. If you look at the 2001 paper in that context, it gets a little formal in parts, but not too much. So we define abstractly what is a measurement experiment, right, through these interaction. And by this, I don't mean statistical interaction per se. What I'm talking about is the encounter. There is an encounter of a respondent, an examinee, a test taker with tasks. And these tasks are items. Then I use the term latent variable to refer to a random variable that is deliberately constructed, derived from the responses to the set of items or tasks that constitutes the building block of a statistical model. And theta is an IRT, factor scores, and factor analysis. In fact, the observed total score is in fact, if you wish, an indicator in that sense there. So here, if you look at it, the statistical problem of measuring a latent variable, because you're measuring a latent variable, can be characterized as involving two key tasks: to find a set of items, scales, tasks, these measurement opportunities that we believe that the latent variable will imply. And so that's A. And then B, to find a methodology for constructing a summary measure or scalar measure of the latent variable from these indicators. So we denote the set of indicators by X sub 1, sub 2, right up to Q. So let's say we had a self-report measure of anxiety, or we had a Q item measure of, so that'd be a Q item measure of self-report measure of anxiety. You might have a Q tasks in measuring writing ability. You may have Q tasks self-report measures to measure health status or patient-reported outcomes, these PROMs or experiences, PREMs. You have these tasks or questions on a measure or a survey of teaching evaluations. Now, there has to be now, you have these indicators. That's the first thing. The second part is find a function, phi of X, so that the numerical value of phi can be regarded as an appropriate scalar measure, a number if you wish, of the unobserved or latent variable. So you've got responses and you're going to create some sort of composite there of some sort through this function, phi sub X. In this slide, it's important to keep in mind that the main goal should always be to make valid inferences about the examinees, but inducing latent variables into the data structure cannot mechanically increase the validity of these inferences. And I highlight this as well to people who are very committed to a particular psychometric model, or even to a psychometric, what they call theory. So if you're a Roche measurement theorist, the Roche model allows you some sort of phi of X as a function of the, if you wish, difficulty or the thresholds of the Q items or tasks. In some ways, it doesn't really matter how, and the Roche model is a beautiful mathematical model, but it's an empirical commitment. So you don't get all the lovely benefits of a Roche model unless there's some closeness, some match, some correspondence with what's implied by the Roche model. No lower asymptote, equal discrimination across all the items, etc. You get that. I mean, that's a beautiful, sophisticated model. But no matter how sophisticated that model is, a test with poor validity will always remain so. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So much of what travels under the umbrella of validity theory and validation practices is the methodology of measurement, testing, assessment, and surveys. And really, there's two questions that I hear. Well, how should one go? And I hear often when I work with professionals in the field, but this is one that I'm also thinking about when I do either theoretical work, statistical work, or practical work, developing surveys or measures. It's how should one go about doing and evaluating measurement validity? And how should one go about doing and evaluating the measurement, testing, or assessment? You can see now that for me, validity really brings us to the methodology of methodology. That is the meta methodology, if you wish. It's a term that I first heard actually when I was studying some graduate courses many years ago in philosophy of science, this notion of a meta methodology, the methodology of the methodology. And so that's what's occurring here. And interestingly enough, this umbrella of validity is, for me and my own particular program of research, a very helpful way of connecting it all. The issue at hand, then, is that one needs to make an inference from a score about the state or status of an observational unit, a person, a student, a survey respondent, a student, a test taker. It could actually even be organizationally, because you get a multi-level measurement, so that individuals may respond to a measure, let's say of health status, but then it's aggregated in a way that individuals are making claims about health regions, provinces, or countries. So it's really an observational unit and an inferential unit. So the issue at hand is that one needs to make an inference from a score about the state or status of an observational unit, whether it is something that is at first glance self-evident or objective, or subjective. And this I'm going to bring up because this has emerged in the last 25 years as something, not just in the social indicators, well-being, quality of life field, but also in educational measurement. So there's this notion that the score in a math test emerges that the math test itself is almost self-evident at first glance. It's objective. Or it's subjective. So if you get self-reported well-being, self-reported stress, satisfaction, life satisfaction, there's all kinds of self-report measures. There seems to be in the field a thread, an undercurrent, that some individuals think some measures are self-evident or objective, something like that, and the other are more subjective. And this is very troubling to me because, in fact, I want to dissuade people to get away from that. My point is that whether one is measuring knowledge reflected in a math test or subjective well-being, one has just one or more of an extensible set of indicators that I talked about before, the surveys, questions, and the tasks, of a construct of interest. And so these indicators, and so you really have you have one or more of these indicators. And yes, there are, in fact, single item measures out there that are used in some domains. How happy are you? Health status measures sometimes are. Validation gets complicated, but if we build a theory like this, we can begin to build a validation framework. My point being is I don't want to sort of bifurcate the world into these ones that are self-evident. I've heard people say, it's a math test. What else could it be measuring? Actually, depending on the kind of how the questions are posed, the kind of domain of mathematics, you may be measuring, let's say, math ability, whatever that may be, as your primary dimension, but you may also be capturing secondary dimensions. That may reflect, in some cases, may lead you to have lack of measurement invariance. You could actually have measurement bias, or you can get a differential item or test function, these secondary dimensions. A math test, for example, if it's a problem-solving test, individuals are reading questions, and then they're constructing responses to the questions. Train leaves from Boston going west, another one leaves from San Francisco going east. You have these kinds of while you're measuring reading along with math, and they're in a problem-based math tests like that, you can't actually separate those two. I mean, the only way you can get those kinds of that area of mathematics is to actually have them read. You can have them listen, but now you're listening. And that's different than subjective measures. So what I'm trying to throw a wrench into here is things are not just some measures are self-evident and others are not. One are more objective and the other is more subjective, depending on the field that you're looking at. In both cases, I argue you are still making inferences to a construct. Importantly, the score on the indicator is not equated with the construct it attempts to reflect, and often, nor is it considered to define the construct in a strict conventional operationism. I hear this at times when people interpret teaching evaluations, those measures, those surveys that are created, that students respond to at the end of every class and every term, particularly in North America, but all throughout the Western world. These are used, and I've had discussions about how these are interpreted by individuals who do make some very important interpretations for career statements for individuals who are teaching these classes. They'll say, well, what else could look at? It's self-evident. It's a measure of teaching. Well, it depends. Is it teaching effectiveness, of which that is the inferential claim is even further, or is it a satisfaction measure? And that there's nothing wrong with a satisfaction or experiential measure, but the inferential leap to it's a measure of teaching effectiveness. Now you've got this construct that there is now a distance between, if you wish, the responses and the construct. And it's, these are not really they're not considered to define the construct in a strictly conventional operationism. That I think we need to get away from that. A few more general remarks and some descriptions of validity. Therefore, what is at issue is whether the constructs are based on an elaborated theory and hence are considered as having the status of being explicitly theoretical. And I say elaborated theory, I really should be putting those in quotations because, for example, it's that, if you have the narrow domain of knowledge, the knowledge test defined in a test blueprint. So that's in a sense the test blueprint, the curriculum, if it's a test in educational testing, that's considered a sort of elaborated theory, and so that is the constructs are based on this and hence are considered as having the status of being explicitly theoretical. Or whether the constructs are merely embedded in a network of expected or hypothesized empirical relationships, these self-report measures. This is one more way of talking about some measures that people consider to be sort of self-evident versus others in which the meaning of them, the interpretation of them, are embedded in a network of expected or hypothesized empirical relationships. And the two kind of examples is, let's say, a blueprint for a knowledge test versus a self-report, psychosocial measure of well-being, stress, happiness. Therefore, for self-reported psychosocial measures, the validation and substantive theory development are inextricably intertwined, whereas this is less of the case for the former, where, for example, test specifications may arise from a prescribed narrow curriculum. Please, my key point here is that there is still inferences. Matters of constructs are still there, and it'll come up in a little bit. So we see construct validity evidence as the central driver for some of these instruments that are thought as objective. To organize the diverse themes and yet reflect different my current thinking in validity, see that I've separated theory and methodology, but please note that that's not meant to imply that theory and methodology are disjoint, but rather it's meant to highlight that one of the central concepts in contemporary validity theory is that validity is not simply a technique or a method. It's not just a correlation. Validity is not a correlation. Validity is not just a factor analysis. So I'm trying to separate these a little bit. So the primary goal today, as I said earlier, is to describe some new methods of validation. However, we believe that one needs to articulate what is meant and what they mean by validity to go hand in hand with the process of validation. And that it is not just, validity is not just a statistical technique. So we need to delve into this quote unquote foundations. To begin with, it's important to note that there is a parallel between the distinction of methodology and method and validity and validation. For those of you who understand this distinction, that I think there is some parallel there that I think is important. We want to consider validity and validation for any test or measure in educational, social, behavioral, or assessment settings. As I said earlier, the general objective focuses on a meta theory of validity rather than a theory tailored for only, for example, cognitive, educational, language, or behavioral measures. I actually argue that even the ones that are tailored are really just instantiations of the broad meta theory. So why don't we embrace the meta theory? Then we can zoom into the particular instantiations for educational language assessment or whatever we happen to be working on. Our aim is to think broadly, to embrace and show the relation between many of the prominent views of validity with an eye towards some synthesis. In what follows, we reflect on the state of the praxis and theorize in validity and validation in general, where it has been, where it is now, and where we think it is and should be going. Along the way, we tend to integrate and summarize major trends in the validity literature, provide some organizing principles that allow one to catalog and then contrast the various validation methods and to shine a light on what we believe is the future of validity theory in the process of validation. All right. That was meant to set a stage to say, okay, there's a broad audience that could listen and try and engage with this webinar and the print material that's available, these slides in PDF. I wanted to set a background for it. what are we talking about? What are the general frame and the general lens? Now let's turn to the concepts of validity. Well, we're going to provide a brief historical overview of validity theory with an eye toward a description of recent work on the theory of validity and the process of validation. This section portrays the concepts of validity undergoing consolidation, debate, and reconceptualization. We raise new questions and reawaken long-standing debates that lie at the heart of empirical science and speak to our collective desire to formalize and better articulate the concepts and measures we employ. As we are reminded in the philosophies of science, particularly ones that came out of a particular logical empirical tradition, but others as well. As we're reminded, linking concepts to observations in the history of validity, relying on nomological network, is a fundamental strategy to clarify the meaning of a measure. So the work of Crombeck and Meehl and that whole tradition of a nomological network is really around trying to clarify the meaning of a measure. In fact, that's where constructs and construct validation has emerged. And to this point, I've tried to highlight for you that even if you believe your measure is so very self-evident, that it is a measure of obviously it's a measure of grade 5 math, or obviously a measure of reading, or obviously a measure of teaching effectiveness, I don't buy it. The constructs are still there. You may believe it is, but in fact it is not. And this also occurs in the field of social indicators research, where we have the quote-unquote objective measures versus subjective measures. In health and medical research, you are still making inferences. You're still making claims from something you believe to be self-evident. All right. Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, pointed out that we understand those things best that we see grow from their very beginnings. We thus begin our discussion of measurement validity with an over-the-shoulder look back at the history of the idea and of procedures that were developed to aid in the validation. The general aim is to trace the history of the concept of measurement validity validation methods from their heuristic beginnings to the more statistically rigorous methods currently available, such as involving item response theory, structure equation model, multi-trait, multi-method matrices, and all sorts of different, very incredibly cognitive diagnostic models, all of these very elaborate, beautiful models, everything from all this very rigorous, elaborated theory to some very heuristic approaches, tracing the history through. What follows, we propose that we consider what appears to be 4 somewhat distinct time periods of validity praxis and theorizing. Please note, we're not suggesting distinct historical periods that are a natural, linear, stepwise progression towards our current thinking. And no, we are not suggesting an evolution to best theories. Please don't take either of those. But it is still helpful to think of distinct periods. Note we are using praxis here to convey a distinction between practice and theory, in a very soft sense here, to highlight the application or use of knowledge and or skills, and also reflect some of what is, in essence, the convention, habit, or custom of validity work of the time periods. So the first one is the early to mid-19th, from early on to the mid-1900s. So early 1900s to the mid-1900s. That was dominated by a criterion-based model of validity, with our focus on content-based validity models. The second was from about the mid-1930s, so you see these overlap, the mid-1930s to the late 1960s, saw the introduction of and move toward the construct model, and its emphasis on construct validity, a seminal piece being Crombeck and Meehl, 1955. And then we have the period post-Crombeck and Meehl, mostly the 1960s to the end of the 1990s. This saw the construct model take root and saw the measurement community delve into a moral foundation of validity and testing by expanding it to the consequences of test use and test use and interpretation. This Messick was among the main advocates and thinkers in this area, and a series of papers there. So we see those sort of three, the early 1900s, the mid-1900s is criterion-based, 1930s, mid-1930s to 1960s, introduction of and move toward the construct model, and then the work post 1960s, and then the period about 2000 to date, in which the debate about validity and validation started up again after a quiet time post-Cronbach and Messick's program of research. These are sort of four broad, I'm going to talk about these sort of time periods. What's interesting is that you see a shift with the criterion models. Really, a measurement is a predictive device or a shorthand. So something's so you're trying to predict something in the future. There's a measure for admissions to college. You're trying to predict performance in first-year college or university courses. The test is taken before they enter, and really you've got a criterion. And it's criterion-based model. You're trying to, and really the tools then become a predictive model. You can also have it being criterion-based if the measurement of something involves a great deal of time and effort, then the measure can actually be a shorthand. So you can either be predictive or a shorthand. And really then the criterion is that thing that it's predicting or substituting for in the shorthand. So a test is really a predictive device. In the mid-1930s to late 1960s, we now see the construct model come about, and post-1960s to 1990s, the construct model takes root. In the construct model, you now see something quite different. A measure, a test, an assessment, a survey is now a reflective, is a reflective device. Through responses to these tasks, these items, one is able to infer and make claims about this construct. And in fact, depending on how you think about constructs, the construct could actually be seen as an explanatory device. And that's what, and in fact, that's, the route I take when I think about this time period is that the construct is part of the explanatory device, this nomological network in which it rests in, and you tests where theory touch data and you test that element. It's this notion that the test is now reflective of something unobserved as opposed to predictive of something. Everything got a little quiet around 1970s for a variety of reasons. Messick did some wonderful work on consequences, somewhat contested. In about 2000, the world began to shake up again. So let me tell you, so 1900 to 2000, you saw the early 1900s to 1930, human being that validity was really a correlation or prediction involving either an objective measure, which was the test is used to measure, a criterion, or anything for which it correlates. Anything for which it correlates is problematic. And that emerged in the 1930s as well. So what you have is, as I said earlier, in this criterion pace, you have a criterion. So it's predicting something else that is actually measurable. Or it's a shorthand for something that is measurable right now, but incredibly involved. So this is a short form or shorthand for it. And there it's really a correlation or a prediction. That is establishing the validity. And that, in fact, in test theory, this whole notion in which we talk about validity coefficients is exactly out of this tradition. There also began this notion that in this time period, which is really an unfortunate time in which a test was really, you didn't have an explicit criterion in that sense. It was really a measure of anything that it correlates to. And so you get very strange sort of questions. Do you prefer to bathe versus shower on a personality measure? And that somehow is correlated to some personality disposition. It's a very, very complicated approach. That one I don't much, it's hard to justify that one. But this notion of criterion is still valid, and that's not gone. I mean, there are measures like this. Mid-1930s to the late 1960s, you see the proliferation of multiple types of validity. And then you'll still hear that every so often. And then we are validating the measures themselves in the psychological literature in the early versions of these APA standards up to 1960s. 1960s to the end of the 1990s, the types of validity talk is still dominant. You just hear discriminant validity, convergent validity, phase validity, as well as methodological developments beyond this validity coefficient that emerged in the early 1900s, to patterns among planned validation studies in a multi-trait, multi-method approach. But the types of validity argument began to get messy because it began to proliferate, and it was hard to keep track of anything. It was not entirely clear what they all meant. Then you begin to have some real changes that go on. Constructs take root, and construct validity is the accumulation of evidence, the 1960s to late 1990s, but it really peaked in the mid-1970s. The landmark paper in this tradition, as I said earlier, is Cronbach and Meehl, 55. And the description of construct validity and the explicit use of the nomological network to establish meaningfulness occurred there. It's in this logical empirical tradition. In a book chapter of mine that I can point to in a bit, I put this within the contemporary thinking in philosophy of science. Paul Meehl, a highly regarded psychologist and philosopher of science, University of Minnesota. And so you hear the logical empiricist kind of work going on in there, and that whole notion of construct and construct validity. But the nomological network was used to establish the meaningfulness of the measure, right? The measure is not self-evident. It's not, oh, it's a predictor of something. No, now you're establishing the meaningfulness of the measure, how to interpret it, along with while interpreting it and working with it. The construct validity is based on the accumulation of research results from late hypotheses and test hypotheses. That was the standards in 74. Cronbach's 71 view is quite interesting, and the later view of validation and perhaps validity as evaluation, and in some sense a process of social rhetorical arguments. If you can get your hands on Cronbach's 71, it's a lovely read, an absolutely lovely read. So you'll see this sort of, earlier on here, if you wish, you see that, the criterion view, as I said, this proliferation of these types into the late 1960s, and even more of these types going on right up into the 1990s. And it got a little bit more sophisticated in terms of techniques as we emerged out of the 60s into the 1990s generally. And then, of course, the construct approach taking root. If one wants to advance the theorizing and practice of measurement, we believe that one needs to articulate what they mean by validity to go hand in hand with the process of validation. So we need to delve into these quote unquote foundational kind of issues. I don't much like that word, but let's use it for now. So we need to exploit the parallel noted earlier between method and methodology, validity and validation. One of the biggest concerns I have, and in the book I edited with Eric Chan on the sort of genre of validation reporting and the types of validation praxis that we did, and then that edited book that we did in Zumbo and Chan. A lot of the validation that was done wasn't really driven by any particular view of validity. And so one of my first concepts I want to bring forward is that, one needs to have a sense of what they mean by validity to go hand in hand with the process of validation. If not, you have really no way of knowing whether you've actually validated your measure. And it's not just stamp collecting, collecting bits of evidence, say, whoop, here we go. There's this notion of one has a view of validity, one justifies that view of validity that they're doing, and then one, again, tests and provides empirical evidence that's based upon your view of the validity. So the 8 conceptualizations of validity, some of which imply a particular process of validation. A test is a predictive device or a shorthand, as I said, of this criterion. Therefore, validity is about establishing whether a test is a good predictive device or good shorthand. I mean, it's really not more complicated. That has some nice appeal to it, actually. So the correlation coefficient determines the validity. Hull, 1928. Validity is the correlation of test scores with other objective measures, of which the test is used to measure. That's Bingham in 37. Primary evidence is criterion correlation and prediction. And you can see some of this in a chapter, 2020 chapter by Jose Luis Padilla and I in a chapter that came out of the American Statistical Association invited conference on advances in questionnaire design. Garrett in 37, the statement of validity is the extent to which the test measures what it purports to measure. The problem with this statement is that it doesn't really imply a process of validation. How does one, it's very difficult to try to articulate a process of validation that emerges from that. Cronbach-Camille in 55, and the logical empiricist influenced nomological network in construct validity. Important because it signaled that test changes from being predicted devices to being signs of an underlying attribute, and I talked about. So validity is about establishing the nomological network. And the unfortunate part about it is that there's actually little to no evidence of actually establishing a nomological network in the work that was reviewed in the edited book by Eric Chan and I. Establishing that network is actually quite a complicated task as a program of research. There's lots of great things that come out of Cronbach-Camille, but one of them that was difficult was how does one actually establish this and verify this, empirically test this nomological network? One can say it's connected to the notion of theory testing more generally, and there is some argument towards that, but even still, one needs to go a bit further down the road in that one. Messick from the 1970s to 1999, and his work is reflected in the standards, even the current standards. Validity refers to the degree to which evidence and theory support the interpretations entailed by the purposes and uses of test. I think that's there's still, Messick is still within a Cronbach-Camille kind of tradition. Constructs, in fact, Messick, one of the claims that Messick would have made, Messick made, was that, construct validity was the whole of validity. So it was really about this evidence coming together to support the interpretation. So he moves it actually quite a long ways beyond just Cronbach-Camille. So validation is the interpretation of test scores required by proposed uses that are evaluated, not the test itself. So you don't say a measure or a survey. So a survey of teaching evaluation is not, in fact, validated. It is the uses that are evaluated. So the process of validation involves accumulating evidence to provide a sound scientific basis for the proposed score interpretations. And of course, there's multiple sources of evidence, consideration of consequences of test use, etc. There's actually a lot of lovely things in the work in Messick's ideas, as reflected even in the test standards. Embretson, I think, is not appreciated well enough. Susan Embretson has done some beautiful work, and I really don't think those of us in the field, including myself, we need to spend more time with Embretson's ideas. Her work on construct representation versus nomothetic span and a universal system for construct validity to illustrate how diverse evidence is relevant to measurement claims. That's really beautiful work. And I think we need to come back to that work, including myself, really need to come back to it. It's well situated for formal cognitive modeling, but it also has other uses. And not too surprising, Embretson does some beautiful work in the area of, the assessment of cognitive abilities writ large. And so formal cognitive modeling is, in fact, the work that Embretson does, and that there really does, in fact, support her thinking in the area of understanding mental rotation tasks and interpretation of scores of mental rotation tasks, et cetera, intelligence tests. Some beautiful work there. Boersboom, Mellenberg, and Van Heerden, in a very lovely paper in 2004, they argue that a test is valid for measuring an attribute if and only if the attribute exists, and variations on the attribute constantly produce variations in the outcomes of the measurement procedure. Again, it's fairly well suited for formal cognitive modeling and somewhat for behavioral modeling as well, or the modeling of behavioral phenomena rather than cognitive but if you take them both in their extreme sense. Boersboom and colleagues did some really lovely thinking here. And the case I make in one of my chapters I think it was it'll come by, it's in the Maryland book. I can give you the citation for it as we go on down. I say that, in fact, Borsboom and myself really are in the same tradition as Cronbach and Meal. That may be alarming to Borsboom, to readers of Borsboom, but in many ways, all three of us are presenting different views of explanation. The Cronbach and Meal, 1955, is within the nomenological network, is within a particular view of explanation. What is explanation? The sort of deductive nomenological approach to explanation that emerged, if you wish, in the sort of logical empirical tradition. Then there's a silence for a long. Then Borsboom and myself both come at looking at explanation differently. He's looking at causal explanation, while my view of explanation, as you'll see in a bit, involves a more is really connected more in sort of a pragmatic approach, a sort of particular type of pragmatism, and really influenced by sort of a view of explanation that is not just purely causal. I don't want to go too much about it here, but you'll see these traditions. Lovely paper, the 2004 paper by Borsboom, Mellenberg, and Van Heerden in Psych Review. Lisitz and Samuelson in 2007, validity is content representation. Well, now this is more, what I said earlier about, what they were talking about there as well. You look at a test, if it has the content representation of a math test, or the items look like they're math items, then it's a measure of math. If these are measures of teaching effectiveness, that's a little, now it gets more difficult. But this notion here that Lisitz and Samuelson have done, I think it's very nice. And it's within that tradition of the sort of more, if you wish, self-evident. You don't have to do all of this. In many ways, Lisitz and Samuelson was a response to Messick and others who said, oh my God, you have to go on, you have to do this. How do you close this? How do you come to a conclusion on validity to make some claims? Lisitz and Samuelson say, forget about all of that. It's far removed. Validity is content representation. Now, this works if one believes that, in fact, the domain they have is almost this notion of it's objective or self-evident. That's why I was talking about this earlier in the presentation. My own work going back to actually 1998, but 2005 onward, in particular, I've taken the view of validity as an explanation of item and score variation, and validation is the process of developing and testing the explanation. I look at sort of a contextualized, pragmatic view of explanation. And so that's why I said earlier, Cronbach and Meal, Borsboom and myself, we're all within this tradition. In fact, I first began to talk about this explanatory view about 1998. 1999, I edited a volume in honor of Sam Messick, and I began to articulate this explanation-focused view in its earlier forms. And there's other papers we have, but I think there is this notion of different kinds of explanation. And so Cronbach and Meal are clearly 1955 is the dominant deductive nomenological view of explanation. Borsboom defined very clearly, it's a beautiful, there's a very clear statement of what he means by explanation. It's really causal. I struggle a little bit. Denny's work is beautiful. I struggle a little bit with what we mean by cause, because it's one of those terms in scientific methodology that requires a little bit more work before one uses it seriously. It's not that I don't think we can establish cause. It's quite to the contrary. I might like to articulate more about what we mean by it. So you'll see Borsboom saying, a test is valid for measuring an attribute if and only if the attribute exists and variations in the attribute constantly produce variations in the outcomes. And in fact, what he does by this is he removes this whole nomenological network, this Cronbach and Meal nomenological network idea, and it has a very clear statement. All right, so it's causal explanation. My own view of explanation that was emerging around the same time as Danny's was, is this view of validity as explanation of the item score variation and validation is the process of developing and testing the validation. And I argue in that point that we are putting ourselves squarely into a scientific mode for measurement. In fact, one could argue you're doing that with Boersboom, and certainly with Cronbach and Meal. That was to try and drive in the roots into the ground. This notion of measurement from a scientific point of view. This at the time, 1955, Cronbach and Meal, Boersboom, and myself. This 1999-2000 era, which it's all been reawakened post-Messick, etc. In my own work, and you'll see some more about it as I carry on, it's particularly well suited as a foundation for cognitive and statistical modeling of item responses and test score data. I also involve what I call a Draper-Lindley-DeFinetti foundation for focusing on heterogeneity. So this is why, if you think of explanation this way, now all my psychometric models, all the statistical framework is all housed around it and to support, and the work that I do is to support this. In 2007, I envisioned a judicial or courtroom metaphor where all the evidence come together and is judged, cases are made, evidence. I'm not the only one, others have tried to use this metaphor. Witnesses come together and a reasoned body judges the evidence, weighing different aspects for validity of the inferences. I moved more away from that in 2009 to a cognitive integration. In 2009 is the chapter that came out of the Maryland conference, and that's where I really try and show that I go back and in essence reread Cronbach and Meal, Boersboom, and my own work within this explanation approach, and that all these are three different kinds of explanation. So I moved more in 2009 towards a sort of a cognitive integration as a way, rather than this courtroom metaphor. In 2011, Barry Forer and I, and there's a Forer in Zumbo, where we then began to take this notion and expand it further to this multi-level validation. How does one validate educational, health, or social indicators if in fact the responses come from individuals, but the claims are made at comparatively of regions or provinces or of nations? So you have this multi-level notion, and within this explanation focused view emerges this multi-level view as well. And response processes are important in establishing the explanatory sort of focused approach. And there's an edited volume by myself and Andy Hubley in 2017, some paper by me in 2017, as well as work by Brian Maddox and I and others, in which I really begin to move towards response processes becoming important. All right, so this is a very busy looking slide, so I'm going to just give you a little bit of a view. I mean, Hubley and I in 2011, we sort of revised view of validity and validation. And we tried to sort of give it a big map overall. And we said, you look at constructs, you look score meaning and inference. So, we articulate a construct, we have score meaning, we get a test or a measure, test, score meaning, and inference. Look at this arrow going back here. Very interesting how test, score, meaning actually shapes the construct in some way as well. And then we have intended social and personal consequences, unintended social and personal consequences. And then we have different kinds of evidence that begin to form this score meaning. Criterion evidence, convergent discriminant, known groups, content evidence or content validity evidence, generalizability and variance across samples, confirmatory factor analysis, if you wish, reliability score structures through a factor analysis or latent class approach. And so you see those informing and things that emerge throughout, but you also see now the consequences can go back and actually shape the construct. Why? Well, constructs change over time. They don't travel. As they travel, as measures, as concepts travel over time and across locations in the world and in subgroups within a location, the construct can actually, it can be influenced. So consequences and intended and unintended ones can actually shape the construct. It's to say that over time, you just don't have a construct fixed, right? Things can, there can be this washback, if you wish, or a feedback loop. Theory and theories more generally in here, and values going everywhere through there. So first, at the core, one can envision that from constructs, one develops tests and measures to which one ascribes test score meaning. An inference from the score meaning, and an inference emerges an intended personal social consequences and or unintended personal social consequences. Very importantly, these consequences and or side effects may also influence test score meaning and inference in that case. Here's the 2011 paper. And you can see that. So you get test construct, right? You get the construct, you get, right? Now you get, one develops a test or measure, and then now one can have these intended and unintended elements to it there. You have test score meaning. Inference is affected and shaped by several forms of validity evidence. You can see the ones that were highlighted in the previous slide: criterion-related, convergent, known groups. And the ones that are chosen are selected depending on the kinds of claims and inferences that you're looking at. Be careful, because there can be hidden invalidity in a measure if you don't explore these various elements. All right? Convergent discriminant may not be all of what you need, nor criterion related, but some of this other evidence is absolutely essential. You, at the very least, need to give it some thought and get to some comparative data in there. The dashed circle encompasses what we could consider construct validity, containing within it the process of validation that provides the various sources of validity evidence and includes consequences and side effects. You bet. We sit very much within the notion of consequences and side effects being relevant here in construct meaning. The centrality of a large dash circle is meant to signify that construct validity is at the core of our unified view of validity and validation. Fourth, one sees theory and theories influence the construct, test and measure, and construct. Theory and theories here, we are referring to and including the theory related to the construct or construct theories, theories related to sample and context, and psychometric models. The type of psychometric models influences the scores we get, influences our claims, and can in fact bound or shape the validity. Finally, we can see that see the effect of values as pervasive. And it includes the impact of theories, broadly defined, the construct itself, test measure, and the impact of values on construct validity, as well as validation choices and decisions. So, I mean, for us, the values are a key part to it. All right, we take a position herein and elsewhere that validity is a matter of inference and the weighing of evidence. Then explanatory considerations guide our inferences. My current leanings are toward inferences of the best explanation. My early influences were Bill Roosevelt when I was a student at the University of Alberta, but later reading the work of Brian Haig, some beautiful papers, Paul Thagard, and doing excellent work. And so because of all of that influence, I lean toward abductive methods and inference to the best explanation as an approach that I lean on. And there's a whole bunch of papers, 3 of which is a book and 2 papers by Brian Haig, absolutely required reading, very lovely. So in our view, in terms of the process of validation, as opposed to validity itself, the statistical models, as well as the psychological and more qualitative methods of psychometrics, work to establish and support the inference to the best explanation. The best explanation is validity itself, so that validity is the explanation, whereas the process of validation involves the myriad methods of psychometrics to establish and support that validation. I've now separated these 2 ideas. This is an interesting meta-theoretical place from which to reread some classic papers in validity and to try and synthesize various views of validity. It's important to highlight that Mike Kane in 2001, as he reminds us, that there's strong and weak forms of construct validity. Weak form is characterized by any correlation of a test score with another variable being welcomed as evidence for validity. That is the the weak form, that is, in the weak form, a test has as many validities and potential uses as it has correlation with other variables. I'm not particularly fond of that approach. And the reason I'm not is that it stops there. It stops there. Certainly as an emergent way of trying to look at novel uses, and if you wish, off-label uses, a concept I began to explore in a keynote address of mine, which is, the video is online. In Glasgow, Scotland, I began to explore this notion of off-label. Certainly that's where it begins, but that is not where it stops. And that's the fundamental problem I have with weak forms of construct validity, is it's hardly evidence at all. In contrast, the weak form, the strong form, is based on well-articulated explanatory theory and well-planned empirical tests of that theory. Fairly standard statement. Now we're moving into a science of measurement. In our view, the strong form of construct validity should provide an explanation for the test scores in the sense of the theory having explanatory power for the observed variation in test scores. We share the view with other validity theorists that validity is a matter of inference, the weighing of evidence. However, in this view, explanatory considerations guide our inferences. Importantly, however, explanation acts as a regulative ideal. Validity is the explanation of test score variation, and validation is the process of developing and testing the explanation. In short, the strong form is theory-driven, like, for example, Cronbach and Meehl, whereas the weak form implies that our correlation with some criterion is sufficient evidence to use the test as that measure. Our view, again, strong form of construct validity should provide a contextualized, pragmatic explanation of the test scores, and I go on about that in my 2009 chapter. Pragmatic view of explanation, emphasizing the context of explanation. And you'll see that in that's the outcomes of what is called the Maryland Conference in Validity, edited book by Bob Lissitz. In essence, we see validation as a higher ordered integrative cognitive process involving everyday and highly technically evolved notions like concept formation and the detection, identification, and generalization of regularities in data, whether they're numerical or textual. So that, to me, is validation is the higher order cognitive integrative process involving these sort of everyday and highly technically evolved notions in data science, if you wish. From this, after balance of possible competing views and contrastive data, comes understanding and explanation. What I am suggesting is a more technical and more data-driven elaboration of what we do on a day-to-day basis in an open scientific society, if you wish. We are constantly asking why the things are the way we find them to be, answer our own questions by constructing explanatory stories, and thus come to believe some of these stories based on how good are the explanations they provide. And that is how we drive validity theory and validation. Here's one way of depicting this four core elements in the integrative cognitive judgment of validity in the process of validation. So you see validity, statistics, social consequences, and matters of utility, all of which are tightly packed in this figure and shape each other, influence each other. See that validity is separate from utility, social consequences. It says, but validity is shaped by them. So this whole cognitive judgment, you don't really separate them. Validity is to establish the why, how, and the sources, right? And the source variables, mediators, and moderators, if you wish. Utility, social consequences, social justice, fairness, psychometrics, error measurement, dimensionality, diff, linking, etc., score comparability. All of this comes together to shape and form validity and the cognitive judgment one makes about it. Furthermore, the inferences are justified by the statistics, social consequences, utility, etc. Basic idea underlying my explanatory approach is that if one could understand the variation in an indicator, that item, that task, then one would go a long way toward bridging the inferential gap between test scores and constructs. According to this view, validity per se is not established until one has an explanatory model of the variation in test or item scores, both of them, really, if you wish. I mean, a test score, overall score, is comprised of items, and the variables mediating, moderating, and otherwise affecting the observed variation. Recall that it's a regulative ideal. Tall hurdle. However, I believe that the spirit of Cronbach-Camille's work is to require explanation in a strong form. So let me bridge some concepts now, transitioning from the concept of validity to research and validation with the aid of an argument-based approach, because this argument-based approach has taken root, and I think it's a very powerful way of looking at things. So I want to bring in the context-based approach in here as well, and I want to bring in the argument-based approach. Excuse me. All right, so let's push on here. In this section, we're going to begin to transition from more conceptual or theoretical considerations to the applied practice of validation. It's an often cited gap between validity theory and the practice of validity, which many trace to the theory of construct validity and difficulty of implementing such a theory. And in fact, you'll see that in Messick, Shepard, Mike Kane's work. And I think they're onto something, absolutely. It grows out of a notion that we validate inferences and uses rather than tests. We must clearly articulate the inference assumptions that move us from observed performances to proposed interpretations regarding construct or uses. In particular, Mike Kane describes an interpretive framework, an interpretive argument, which clearly states the assumptions and inferences that move us from an observation to a final interpretation or decision. Then, in a separate process called a validity argument, we evaluate the plausibility of the inferences and assumptions we have proposed. So it actually was first proposed by Cronbach in 1988, but more systematically elaborated and done a lot of work with it, and in fact, really taken it to a much higher level with the work of Mike Kane, and there's actually even more papers post-2009. Cronbach 88, Kane 92, 2006, Shepard in 93, and others advocate using argument as a way to frame or focus validation efforts and to clarify intended interpretations and uses. The main advantage of the argument-based approach to validation is the guidance it provides in allocating research effort and engaging progress in the validation effort. So I think that's really quite a powerful approach. And really, it's an approach to validation. What is validity, I think, is quite interesting. I think validity, in my interpretation, still is very much sort of a Messick. I mean, Messick still in many ways is underneath all of them, and perhaps even a form of Cronbach-Camille. So the constructs and such, at least in some senses, can be part of it. And in some cases, we want to make a final decision, and others we arrive at a description about a person. So what does an interpretive argument look like? What follows are three examples how we might go from an observed performance to a final interpretation. Various studies may evaluate and investigate one or more of these inferences and gather evidence to support or refute them. This would be done as part of the validity argument. And then you'll see Kane in 2006, the interpretive argument is to provide a clear statement of the inferences and assumptions inherent in the proposed interpretation uses test results, and these inferences and assumptions are to be evaluated in a series of analyses and empirical studies. While the interpretations discussed in sections 3 and 5 here, what you'll see are evaluated in terms of the coherence. Highlight these are essentially different forms of interpretive arguments rather than different arguments per se. Well, you can see here in Kane's argument-based approach to validity, you see the observed performance. There's a performance. There's scoring, which gives you a score. There's generalization to a universe score, and then extrapolation to a target score or skill. And you can give it a construct label, and trait interpretation. Or you can use for something like placement or some sort of decision making. And different forms of interpretive arguments we can see here, an interpretive argument followed by the validity argument, and then descriptive versus decision-based interpretations are all throughout all of this. Another way of depicting this is you have an observation, an observed score, a universe score, interpretation of the level of skill, perhaps, and the decision or use. So you have throughout this, there's actually, for those of you who know generalizability theory, you actually can see Michael Kane has done important work in the area of generalizability theory and G theory. Well, you can actually see it really in really encapsulated in some of Michael's work in argument-based. That's not surprising, shouldn't be surprising at all. You see the connection to, for me, I see a connection to the Draper-Lindley-DeFinetti approach that I described, at least in one of the earlier times I described in 2007. And Michael talks about competency versus construct. That becomes important in here. So you can have a competency or construct. And in a sense, competency and construct begin to articulate this, at the very beginning, when I talked about these sort of objective or more explicit versus the self-report subjective. Well, competency and construct begin to talk about this a little bit and separate it in there. You'll see Michael talk about both of those. Lyle Bachman did some beautiful work, and his 2005 paper in particular in Language Assessment Quarterly, I really found it very interesting. Lyle differentiates between arguments that lean toward a description versus those that lead toward a particular decision. So, for example, Bachman differentiates between making inference about a potential candidate's language ability, certain case tasks, from the subsequent decision about which to hire that person, for example. So you may actually use language in a work context, so language for in a workplace. And so what he's trying to differentiate is between making inference about a potential candidate's language ability in certain tasks from the subsequent decision about whether to hire that person. This differentiation is very important. I thought he in conversations with Bachman, I found that he feels there's not enough systematic attention focused on supporting the decision as compared to stating the interpretation. That's something that I think is, if you read Lyle's work or had listened to him, I thought that comes through pretty clearly. And he proposes the following framework. This creates a separate argument for those cases in which we are also evaluating particular use, not only interpretation. And this is one way of, he begins in a sense the same kind of idea: observation, observe score, universe score, interpretation. So you have scoring, generalization, extrapolation. This is the interpretive validity argument of Bachman. That leads to a decision. It may lead to a decision. And that's about utilization or use. And that's the utilization argument or the use argument. And I thought that was really nice. What I like about this is it does separate this, and it highlights this use as something that needs to be investigated in a sense. Well, it draws attention to it. So you do need to address it. It's not just about the interpretation, right? I kind of like that idea a great deal. And then you can now look at this utilization, and then you can get relevance, utility, intended consequences, sufficiency, etc. And these are the warrants for the utilization argument. Actually, this is a very nice approach to actually looking at it. If you apply this to teaching evaluations, well, then you get observations or the scores on responses from students on a teaching survey. Then you get the observed score. Then there is some sort of universe score that these are instantiations of. So you get this error of measurement, if you wish. And then you get its interpretation. And then separately, the utilization for promotion, tenure, career elements. And that this needs to be evaluated as an interpretive validity argument. So hold that. Our responses from students on a teaching evaluation, are they in fact, is there evidence there that these are in fact, from an interpretation point of view, teaching effectiveness, or are they rather student satisfaction or students' perceptions of what they, or students' experiences? Those are all great things. But to make the extrapolation from the universe score to the interpretation really is this interpretive argument. And then there's the use of it, the utilization, setting cut scores, making decisions, etc. And that deals with relevance, utility, intended consequences, and sufficiency. Absolutely lovely way. Language assessment and a lot of other areas can follow up that way. What I then do is, so we say, okay, well, let's bring together the earlier work by Hubie and I, and let's bring together with arguments. So after considering these argument-based approaches, Let's go back now and return and consider how they fit with the concept of validity that I talked about earlier. So we rearrange the various sources of evidence that feed into the interpretations. And then we can examine whether different forms of evidence might be used to support the interpretive argument. Notice that this ends with an interpretation rather than a decision. So as I have mentioned, this still raises issues about consequences involved. And adding the utilization aspects discussed by Bachman brings in a new set of evidence. Here it's very clear that consequences of using a particular test to make a decision needs to be considered or addressed. So now what we have here is so the first thing, so we start with this, we then rearrange it. All right, so we sort of move the boxes around to make it a little easier. Then you can see reliability is about scoring. Generalization is content evidence, generalizability and variance across samples test. Then you have this extrapolation, right? Criterion, related evidence, known groups, score structure, convergent, etc. You now have relevance, intended consequences, utility, sufficiency there under utilization. And you can see how the intended social and personal consequences, because there are intended consequences of assessment, and also the unintended ones feed it there. So just to take it back 1 second, just remind you, right? If we sort of scroll back, that's the first presentation of it what you saw. We rearrange some of the boxes. You now begin to overlay scoring, generalization, extrapolation, and utilization. And now you see this coming together here. This is still all construct validity. And it comes together that way. The advantage here is that you're actually borrowing strength from what Hubley and I presented, which is different than the argument-based approach. And because the problem with the argument-based approach in some senses is that the notion of meaning, I mean, at least some of the early, I mean, it's in Bachman, he has interpretation squarely in Bachman's approach. And so there is some construct notions in here as well. But the advantage of bringing it all together with the two views, the argument-based approach, and basically resulting in this final model, which is the merging of it together, is that it now actually together brings in explanation, brings in the explanatory view, draws all the benefits that way in this approach. It's one that I like. We've been using it for a while, trying to develop it further, but I really like layering in arguments, the argument pros with the view that we had come together. There's great deal of value because they're really quite different sort of frameworks, and now you bring them together, and I think there's something even stronger out of it. At a more conceptual, we might compare the argument-based approach and explanation-based approach view by posing the following question. Right, so let's contrast them, right? Because here we were bringing them together, but let's contrast them. And we might compare them, right? And you pose the following question. Is an explanation an argument, or is an argument an explanation? Well, there's multiple answers to this. Turning to logic, explanations are seen as types of arguments. So there are at least two types of arguments, justificatory and explanatory. Here we're borrowing some work from Sinnott Armstrong and Fogelin. My apologies if I mispronounced the names. So one asks this question, is an explanation an argument, or is an argument an explanation? And I've thought about that for a while because I've been explanation focused. I say, okay, is explanation an argument, or is an argument an explanation? There's multiple answers to this, but turning to logic, explanations can be seen as types of arguments. And there's really two types of arguments, justificatory, and explanatory. And now you can begin to play with this in this merged theory. So distinguish largely by purpose or use rather than form. So explanatory provides an explanation of why or how something we agree, right, about has happened and how did we arrive at a particular interpretation. And justificatory, forgive me, I'm tongue-tied today, provides reasons for belief. Why should I accept the proposed interpretation? You begin to layer this in the model, that merged model with my model with the arguments approach. And now this explanatory and justificatory components begin to play out quite nicely. So focusing on the purpose of the argument brings our attention to who the audience is. This may be important. So the interpretive argument as explanatory and the validity argument as justificatory, perhaps. These two sorts of arguments often have similar forms moving through the chains of inferences, but their purposes and the context in which we use them will often differ. Please note that inference of the best explanation essentially combines these. First, we formulate an explanation, then a justificatory argument to convince us it is indeed the best possible explanation. There's an interesting parallel here between focusing on the use of a test to guide validation work. Similarly, we can focus on the use of the argument to guide our construction of the argument. This becomes very interesting. It can focus on the use of the argument to guide our construction of the argument. Although it's clear how the argument serves to evaluate the particular pieces of the interpretive argument, what standards ought to be used to judge whether the interpretive argument in context is complete or serves this purpose. And that's still a bit of some questions there. Messick asked that. Right? It's clear how the validity argument serves to evaluate the particular pieces of the interpretive argument. What standards ought to be used to judge whether the interpretive argument in context is complete or serves its purpose. Here, perhaps by conceptualizing the interpretive argument as explanation, we get a set of new criteria for explanations by which to evaluate our interpretive argument. I think that is, in fact, an important step forward, By framing the two parts of the validity argument as explanatory and justificatory, we can leverage various frameworks for evaluating explanations in the service of developing our interpretive argument. In addition to Keynes' clarity, coherence, plausibility of inference and assumptions, we can begin to look at implicit assumptions that can be harmful because they may be left unexamined. So this hidden invalidity and that's really masked inside these assumptions, these implicit assumptions are important. Just as measures are fallible, hence the need for validation, so too are arguments fallible. And some arguments may be solid in one context, but not in another. So hence we need an analogous procedure to be sure our arguments are sufficient in a particular case, the same way we evaluate whether a test or use is sufficient in a particular context. So criteria for inference to the best explanation is really what comes up here. So think selecting the best interpretive argument. And you'll see this lovely quotation. In sum, a hypothesis provides the best explanation when it's more explanatory, powerful, falsifiable, modest, simple, and conservative than any competing hypotheses. I think that's a very nice articulation that can help us as we begin to move into these new kind of domains. So let me make some concluding remarks, and then we can wrap it up. Just a few more slides. It's been a long webinar. What the view and validity and validation implies, an important issue. When can we start using a measure, or do we need to establish the validity, that is explanation for the test and item responses or response variation, before we can use the measure to make inferences and reach conclusions? The answer, explanation is a regulative ideal. And if you go back to what we said a moment ago about, criteria for inference the best explanation, this is where we begin to say it's a regulative ideal. As we begin to meet it's more explanatory, powerful, falsifiable, modest. These are the kinds of arguments, the kinds of standards, that we can set up. So, but it's still, explanation should be a regulative ideal. What I'm suggesting is that assessment research take on a robust and integrative research agenda, which the bounds and limitations of the inferences we can make from scores, and hence ferreting out invalidity becomes a core task of the research agenda. The demands are high, but we believe that they are in line with the desires spelled out in the seminal paper by Cronbach and Meehl, read as a strong program of construct validity. One thing that gets highlighted in my own work on the Draper-Lindley definity is that in general, in psychometrics, do not unthinkingly assume homogeneity, work where possible with multi-level latent class models, and begin to develop more nuanced explanatory models that allow you to account for the heterogeneity in a target population. In the tradition of inference to the best explanation or abductive methods, the latent variables or factor analysis may take on explanatory role. Yes, my friends, they do. And that's kind of what Borsboom does with the causal notion. He's sort of established it, and then he's doing this causal direction. So I want to thank you for your time. It's been a long webinar, but I think we have covered a great deal of important ground, and I hope the lovely thing about it being a video recording is that you can pause halfway through or partway through and take some notes. I wish you all the very best. Thank you so much for engaging in this, and I look forward to the next webinar.